So, we'll start with introductions for those of you who haven't heard it in 6 months. But David Crane worked at Atari when no one was now, founded Activision by leaving Atari, and then hired these two guys who were in the East Coast, in New Jersey, with their own office, put them in their own office to make games. They eventually spun off, and then we all got back together eventually.
We, Dan and I started in the toy industry, did electronic toys. Then I reverse engineered the Atari platform on the East Coast, and did Space Jockey, and then Donkey Kong for Coleco, and then we joined David over at Activision.
Yes, Gary and I started in the software business with the electronic toys and games. Then we left that and worked in his basement for a couple of years, publishing in 1979 and 80 Apple II games. And then Gary reverse engineered the 2600 and taught me how to do it. We joined Activision in 82. My first game was Crackpots. Then I did Kung Fu Master, Ghostbusters, and a number of other titles.
So,
We are now Audacity Games, which we launched in 2021. Interestingly, it just dawned on me this morning that Audacity was launched to do new games on old hardware, and it was launched before Atari announced that they were going to put out new hardware that's compatible with old hardware. So obviously it was good for us. We were initially just doing games to work on the old machines that you could buy on eBay, but we're glad to see a new generation of hardware coming out that's compatible with the Atari, and our games are compatible with the 2600 plus and 7800 plus. So we're very excited about that. We're showing our games over at our booth, 1143. You're younger than me, you remember things. So we're showing Circus Convoy, which David and I did, released a couple of years ago. And we are announcing at this show that Casey's Gold, which Dan's been working on for quite a while, is now coming out before the end of the year.
Is finally releasing.
And we also released 4 or 5 months ago Alien Abduction by John Van Ryzen of Hero fame. And that's been received very well. So we're going to have 3 Atari 2600 compatible games out by the end of this year. More coming next year.
So the reason we did it, we would come to these shows, we would talk, everybody liked to hear stories about how the old games were made, and we can certainly get into that. And someone always would ask, why don't you make us new games? And the amount of effort that took was substantial, and so we kind of balked at it for many years. And then finally, Gary and I just looked at each other and said, all right, let's see what we can do. The problem is, every tool that we ever used is obsolete and gone. Development systems, fortunately, there's some ways to do it online, and Stella, of course, has development capability as well. But we didn't have a cartridge, so we had to create an injection molded cartridge. We didn't have boxes, manuals, labels. Plus, we tried to put in some interesting technology. Every one of our games has a unique serial number, and that serial number is registered to you as a registered user at audacitygames.com. And then I put in QR codes, and that's really fun, so that on an Atari 2600, back in the old days, you'd get a high score, you would take a picture of your screen on a Polaroid and send it in to Jan Marcella in the Activision office, and she had a staff of 6 people. We were getting 14,000 letters a week at one point, getting those patches and posting high scores. They'd go in the newsletter and all. And so instead of taking the Polaroid picture, I put up a QR code on the screen, which was a challenge, believe me, doing it in 8 bits. And so you scan it with your smartphone, and it will actually submit your high score to our global high score board automatically for you at the end of the game. that kind of technology that we just kind of brought the 2600 into the modern era.
So we're now up and running, doing 2600 compatible games, and we were asked to talk about the difference between doing 2600 games today and doing them 45 years ago. And it's fascinating because every time people brought up, should we do it, Dave and I would have lunch the next day and go, you know, it's 40 years later, it's gotta be easier. You know, it'll probably not run out in 3 months. And then we look at each other and said, why the hell would it be easier? It's no easier. There's nothing that's made it easier. So Dave wrote a very nice tool which helped with art development, because if you know the 2600, you know that art is not pictures. It's much more complex than that. So Dave did a very nice tool that helped. We were able to do things on Circus Convoy, which had never been done before, things like the giant snake that goes after you, stuff that's really pushing the envelope. And we continue to upgrade the tools, we continue to work on new ways to make it more efficient, but in the end of the day, we're still writing 6502 assembly language code. And instead of filling one bank, we're filling 32 banks. So that's why some of the games have taken a little longer than necessary.
Yes, mine was
Or
definitely.
maybe not necessary, but a little longer
Mine
than
was definitely a
anticipated.
part-time effort. I took a number of months off in the last 6 years and dealt with things like taking care of my mother-in-law and other things. But going forward, I assure you, our games will not take 6 years to release. But it is, as Garry said, we thought it would be an easier process, but it's very tough to fill those 32
And you're
banks.
still counting every cycle.
You're still counting every cycle on the scan line. You're still rewriting a display a number of times to fit more things and squeeze more things. But the tools definitely help. I started my development separately from these two guys, so I didn't have the benefit of tools, and I kind of went back to using graph paper to do all of the art in the game. Garry came along and helped with some of the art in the last 6 months using the tools, which made things much easier and frankly made them look better than I could do, being Gary's an artist and I'm not. But thank God we have new tools now that Dave created. But we do write, we have the Stella. In the old days we would debug with the system that Dave created with Bob Whitehead, and we would have logic analyzers in the office that we'd bring in and clip onto the 6502 and be able to do some various things like see what memory locations are getting hit and what numbers are going in. And fortunately, Stella has all that for us now. So in a way, it's a little easier with the debugging, but as Garry said, it's still tediously writing 128K bytes of 6502 assembly code.
But it's fun as hell.
It's fun as hell.
I mean, being hard doesn't mean it's not fun.
We would do it if we couldn't sell them because it's just fun to make them.
Yeah, we have a really fun time doing it. We love the reaction we get from the fans when we come to shows like this. People are really, it's more to them than just buying a game. It's going back in time. It's going back to the 1980s and having the experience of opening something on Christmas morning. People are really love that feeling of nostalgia, and that keeps us doing it.
And frankly, when you have a vision in your mind and you spend a couple of weeks writing the kernels in 6502 and creating the art on graph paper and putting it in, the moment you hit that switch and it lights up and it's on the screen, it's just as fun as when you see our cartridges for the first time. We get a great charge out of saying, oh my God, it looks like I thought it did, or even better. Sometimes it looks worse and you have to rewrite it, but
Sometimes it never looks.
we get great satisfaction to bring what's in our mind onto the screen, and that's what keeps us doing it.
It's tough to make things look good when you have a machine where one of the rules that we work by is if we envision an object and we put it on a screen and the average person can't tell what it is,
That's right.
then we don't use it.
Yeah. I had objects in Circus Convoy that Garry said, are those toilets? and they were not toilets, but Garry rewrote.
Casey.
Casey's, I'm sorry,
Right.
Casey's, that Garry redrew for me, thank God, they now look like railroad crossings. But yes, that's the rule. If someone can't tell what it is, we take it out.
Now, that's actually been the case since the 1980s. When
Right.
you're drawing pixels, 8-bit pixels, objects, and sometimes you're limited to 8 wide of those pixels, you'll have artists and even non-artists color in pixels until you can finally hold something up and say, I get it, that looks like a bird. That means you could design a game that has a bird in it. But you don't say, I'm going to design this and it's going to have, I mean, that scorpion and those crocodiles are really pretty cool. But I only put them in because they looked good, not because I designed a game and I have to have a scorpion in it. It wasn't until I did a scorpion and I said, that's good enough, that I could then put it in Pitfall.
There's a funny story about this. The only one I've put in a game where there was any doubt was Keystone Capers. The radios, the cathedral radios sitting on the ground with the sound waves coming out of them. I put that in honor of our dad, who was a antique radio collector. So that was kind of an homage to him. And I knew that, I mean, they looked like radios to me, but some people have sometimes said, well, I'm not sure what that was. And I really found out the truth when I spoke to a big fan from Brazil. Because in Brazil, they didn't come with the US manuals. So it was never described what that was. And he told me that it was a regular discussion at game conferences to try and figure out what those objects were. No one ever knew they were radios. They were radioactive things that were letting off whatever. They were something on fire.
Yeah.
And he asked me, what are they? And I told him radios. He goes, oh my God. And it was like, just go back and publish it in a newspaper in Brazil. No one has any idea what they are because they never read the manual.
Well, and for all we know, that style of radio never made it to Brazil.
That's true.
That's
You know,
Yeah, that's
in all of history.
more of a
Who knows?
1920s thing for us.
So I always chuckle when I see those radios. I say, what are those things anyway?
I had a guy from Europe once come and say, why do you put rabbits in the game? There are no rabbits running around in Europe. You should use squirrels, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, it has nothing to do with what they should be or what they look like. And they're recognizable, we use them.
Yeah.
In fact, the story was, I did slot machine at Atari, and somebody just said, hey, you know what, we've got this entire graphic artist department in Atari, and they're doing the manuals and all the advertisements and stuff. And why don't you get them over to help you with the slot machine graphics? And so I had these two girls come over, and I said, here's what we have to do. We're doing a slot machine, so it'd be really nice if it had cherries and lemons and oranges and all those things that most slot machines had. And so I said, okay, so here's what you got to do, and you either have to do it in 8 bits or 16 bits with vertical symmetry, so reflected around the middle. And they started to draw 8 bits, and by the time they, try to imagine 3 cherries. Well, 3 cherries look like 3 plus signs. Because that's all you've got, it's all the pixels you've got. So they just threw up their hands and went away. And that's why in my slot machine game, there's a car which has symmetry in 16 bits. There are cacti, bars are real easy. The horizontal bars that are in the slot machines. And what else is on there? The Liberty Bell. What could you do in 16 pixels reflected and 1 color? We didn't have color on those things.
I did a lot of the art in Circus Convoy, and when I tell people that, they say, oh, you didn't do anything technical, you were just drawing. I said, no, the art in Atari 2600
Coding.
is not pictures.
It's an algorithm.
It's much more complicated than that, and that is impossible to explain to anyone. They have no idea what you're talking about. So anybody have any questions about developing in the modern era on these ancient machines? Yes.
I do have a follow-up about what you're saying about art, because my understanding is that there's just like a bank of addresses where you just have your pixels in, but if you say it's an algorithm, is that, how do you go about implementing images via an algorithm?
There's no bank with pixels.
All right, I mean, without getting too technical, which is hard to do and still answer this question, the 2600 has a one-line bitmap. You know, most games have 192 by 160 or whatever bitmaps, right? Well, it's one line, and you can't control every pixel of those one lines. You can actually only fix 19 of the pixels. 2 groups of 8 and 3 dots, and you can put them anywhere you want. So what you're really doing, and then you do that, you put that on a screen, and then the TV scan shows it to you. And in the time the TV scan retraces and gets ready to do the next scan line, you have to change all of those graphics so that it looks like the second line of the object and the third line of the object. Okay. So that's really good, except you still can only do tank with that. That's what it was designed to do. It could do 2 tanks shooting at each other. But because you can also move things around in between scan lines and change their size from single, double, quadruple, and all this kind of stuff, you can then say, all right, I'm take it, Garry, when he did the giraffe. The giraffe in Circus Convoy, you just look at it and you see that looks like a giraffe. Well, if you'd seen what other people try to do to make it look like a giraffe on the Atari 2600, you would then be impressed with how good it looks.
Yeah.
That has multiple colored objects, slightly tweaks this one, each scan line, it gets moved by a little bit and then displayed. This one peeks out through a hole in the graphics left by the other object, you know, and
They're
it's
layered on top of each other.
It's actually more like sculpting. You start at the top of the object, and you create something, and then you say, I'm going to shift it a little this way, and then I'm going to shift it again. Next line, I'm going to use twice the clay, and then I'm going to shift it down over here. So there's a, quote, algorithm for each vertical line on an object. That's how we do like the snake. The snake is long and thin, and we're able to sculpt it as it goes down the screen.
And stretch it out for each scan line.
So that algorithm, while it isn't computer code, it's a long, complex series of numbers that defines how the sculpture changes as it moves down the screen. And it's something you cannot do in your head. You can try, but God help you.
and worse, it is iterative and dependent. So you come up here and you say, you know, I would like his nose to be 1 pixel longer. So on the second line, you shift it 1 to the right. Well, that means that this band of sprite is now shifted 1 to the right all the way down.
Carries
So you
everything
go
with it.
all the way
is what I
back
do.
down, and you say, okay, I'm going to move it 1 to the left. Well, that's great, except there's a hardware limitation that you can only move it 7 pixels in one direction and 8 pixels in another. And now what you've done is you've made it so that it won't go all the way back by the time you try to move it back. So that's why there's a tool. So the tool is actually, you fiddle with it up here, and then you work on it, and oops, I screwed up, you go back, and you work it all the way down. So like, talking about this, the snake. Garry did the snake, and you'll see it's multiple colors, multiple sprite objects are used, and everything. And it's got this shape so that it gets longer and longer. He then handed it to me, and I wrote an algorithm that would actually change the amount of movement on each scan line so that the snake can move this way and it shears and it extends out and it will strike.
Well, let's be
Yeah.
clear. When Dave says multiple sprite objects, the snake is made out of 2 tank objects and two little dots.
Yeah.
So
And when we're all done and we have the snake,
it looks like a snake.
and it's moving around like that, I turn to Dave and go, you know there's no one else on the planet that could do that snake.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, we could never do it if we hadn't done 40 years of experience on this crazy machine.
Which is crazy because the story with Casey's Gold is these gentlemen started writing Atari games and they told me about a tool, and I said, oh, let me see if I can recreate a game I had back in 1983 that I very briefly started and never finished, and I have vision in my mind of what it looked like, and I started to recreate it from scratch. And then 6 months into that process, my wife found the cartridge of the original game I had started in 1983, and it was amazing to put it in and turn it on, and it was amazing how much I had remembered almost exactly what it looked like, but my version today looked amazingly better than it did in 1983. I guess the experience I had for all these years has paid off. So I was better now than I was then, even though I had to relearn the system when I went back into it. I just didn't remember how it worked.
Additional questions? Go ahead.
I had a question about the manufacturing and the, because back then it was, master ROMs, circuit boards. I'm assuming is there a company you went to that said, okay, I want all these cartridges manufactured? You have to pretty much, create
Dave?
the templates and the.
Dave is the
There's
company.
a guy we went to.
He wasn't doing anything.
His name was Dave Crane.
Had a little extra time.
Well, as a preface, there's a lot of homebrew cartridges out there, and what they're doing is,
Or at least what they were doing, we're not sure.
I think they're still doing it,
Exactly.
is they've taken the cartridge. What they do is they get old plastic and steam off the labels, and then they have a new circuit board, and that circuit board has an ARM processor in it running at 60 megahertz. The 6502 in the 2600 runs at 1.2 megahertz. So they're now writing games not for the 2600, but for this built-in new game system that's inside the cartridge, and then they basically end up just putting it through the Atari 2600 so it'll go to the screen. So we got ornery, and we said, we're not doing this. We are not going to use any technology that did not exist in 1982. But I couldn't buy a 4K ROM. You cannot, they don't sell it. I think if you actually have to have a 4K ROM or 4K EEPROM, I think you can get them for like $150 from some collector. So we ended up with larger ROMs. So that's the only concession that we made to modern, is we couldn't get any smaller ROMs, so we just build a larger ROM. But we weren't going to go buying cartridges and steaming off the things. So I sat down with Autodesk Inventor and created the cartridge that we use today. I designed the PC board that would handle that size ROM we're talking about, and one of the nicer bank switch standards that have been around since the 1980s, called SuperBank. And so that became the basis of our cartridge, brand new cartridge. Company is in Ohio, but I'm sure they have all their stuff done in China, but I work with a company in Ohio. And then the circuit board is actually manufactured. I got a manufacturer right here in Silicon Valley that he also sends everything out, but he does the final assembly. So we end up with a plastic shell, a new circuit board, and then I add an RFID tag inside the cartridge. They screw it together for us, and that's delivered to me. It's a blank cartridge. So the next thing I did is I built a custom box that is an EEPROM programmer that can program the cartridge, can program the EEPROM after it's been soldered onto the cartridge. There's actually a couple lines in there and some circuitry.
So we have blank cartridges.
Right. So you order a game, and I take a blank cartridge, plug it into this machine, and the object code is already stored in that machine. I burn that EEPROM, put a label on it, and it's now Circus Convoy, where before it was blank. While doing it, we also wanted to have some protections. Obviously, you don't want people just to buy one of your games and then dump the ROM and either sell it or give it away or whatever. So that's where the serial number came in. There's a serial number, there's other encryption built into it in secret little places and such. And the main benefit is you could pirate the game. It's obviously public and it's just a ROM pattern, right? You could pirate the game, but then it would have someone else's serial number in it, which is already registered to their name. And so you can't register it and you can't submit scores on it. So and if somebody starts putting it out, I know whose it was. We have that as well. But all that stuff had to be built into this whole thing before we made our first game.
At the same time, you're writing your first game.
True.
Yeah. Now, just for anybody who doesn't know, an RFID is a tiny, tiny, tiny little chip that they use on clothing and CDs and everything, where if you bring a wand close to it, it reads a serial number off the unit. And they're so inexpensive that they're on virtually everything these days. And So we used them on there, so we could pick up a cartridge that we sold, sweep a wand over it, and get the serial number, and consequently know whose it is.
And better than that, well, first of all, now we had to build a web presence to be able to sell these games.
And a backend.
So I've written about 50,000 lines of code of HTML, JavaScript, and PHP, and created this whole system that you can go to at audacitygames.com. And because of that RFID, which is actually central to everything else, once this thing has been programmed, I know what serial number has what RFID, which means when it goes over to the shipping department, which is usually me sometimes only anyway, sometimes we bring in other people when we've got a lot of stuff to do, you scan the RFID code and it immediately prints out the packing list, the label, and you slap it into a box and ship it. So got it as automated as possible, and it's just kind of cool to use that RFID chip for that.
In the back there?
Yeah, comment and a question. Number one, just really appreciative of all the work that you three have done for everybody in this room, but everybody
You're so welcome.
who cares about the Cretaceous period. I think that's special. I know that it takes a lot of time to do these things and the checks and balances and trying to make sure everything looks right. It's really appreciated. My question revolves around sound for these games, and how do you go ahead and think about what's going to keep something fresh as you move forward to the next project? How do you not recreate sounds that existed previously, just so that you don't trigger that memory bank in other people's ideas?
Well, the problem with sound is it's even harder than the graphics. The 2600 can make 2 or 3 bloops and bleeps, and that's about it. But we can create a sequence that every 60th of a second changes the frequency, the tone, the type of tone, and such, to make something more interesting. But there's only so many jumps, There's only so many, they call bell trees. If you do a real sound effect where you get like a harp or whatever, and there's just only so many things we can do. So you will recognize. That's one of them.
Explosion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Static.
You will recognize a lot of the sound effects, but we do make an effort not to make them the same. But there's a whole lot of trial and error too.
Yeah, I mean, you use a tool like Audacity, not named after Audacity Games, but it's a tool, Audacity, it's a sound editing tool. And it's actually fun to go in there and play around, and from that, get a sense at least of different sequences of frequencies and playing with volume, and then going back and recreating that in a data table that we put in the custom code that runs that data table and tries to recreate the waveform in Audacity. And it's somewhat frustrating that we can't make the same monumental leap in sounds that we do in graphics. The more we work with it, the better the graphics are. Sounds can only do so much.
And as almost everybody knows, if you try to play music on the Atari 2600, you get a lot of tones that are flat. It was not designed to put out the chromatic scale. It was designed to divide down from 3.58 megahertz color clock crystal. And Garry has a story you can tell about how that...
Everybody probably knows that story, but I'll tell it anyway. I found out the other day it's in Racing the Beam. I didn't know that story is in Racing the Beam. I was frustrated as anybody when I used to buy Atari cartridges and play them and hear this horrible sound and go, what are they trying to do? Why all the songs are horrible? And when I started programming it, I said, why are the songs horrible? And I figured out what Dave said. I mean, most of them are not in tune, and you can't make them in tune. You request a tone, you get a tone. I mean, it's already built into the hardware what the frequency is of the tone. So I had an idea before Pressure Cooker. I wanted a jingle, and I didn't put a jingle in my earlier games because I wasn't going to put in a bad jingle. So I got a Casio keyboard, and I triggered all the tones on the Atari and compared them to a Casio keyboard output. and every time I found a key that matched the tone perfectly, had to be perfect, not a little sour, just perfect, I marked on the Casio keyboard, I marked it. And then I brought in a professional jingle writer, who's still an active musician today. I looked him up yesterday. Somebody was asking me. A guy named Steve Gabori, and he's written a lot of jingles. I brought him in, and I put a keyboard in front of him with maybe 7 or 8 keys with marks on them. And I said, write a jingle for this game, but only use those keys. And he said, what? And I said, can you write a song using only those keys? And he said, I think so. And he did. So if we put songs in games, that's the way we do it. You can only work with what you have. And out of all the crazy stories I've told about my career, that story gets repeated more than anything. I've seen it in PhD papers on the history of computer music. I found it in Racing the Beam. It's all over the place. I've had music industry magazines call me and ask about it. It's very funny. But it was really a very simple idea. I'm amazed nobody had done it before me.
Well, and in fact, since this is about then and now, something that I get very little credit for is I took out my Casio keyboard and I did the exact same thing. And I wrote the song that Circus Convoy starts with. It's a 2-part harmony I composed, arranged, and put that in the game. Nobody even knows. These guys don't even give me credit for creating
Sorry,
Dave.
Dave, it's a wonderful song.
Next. What do we got here? Yes.
Having that much more memory than I had back in the day, with 128K, is this a good thing? Like you can do whatever you want, or is it a bad thing that you don't know where to stop?
No, it's a good thing. I mean, you can use it in a stupid way. Well, but it's actually, and I don't know if you've done this yet, but let's say I have this incredible graphic that takes a quarter of the size of a bank, right? Well, if I wanted to make the most amazing animation that's ever been done, I can make 16 frames of it, put it in 16 banks, and just switch banks and this beautiful animation happens. We haven't done that yet.
Oh, that's my next game.
That's what I figured.
But an example is when you do tight games like Circus Convoy or when I did in Casey's Gold, different train cars are in different banks, but the conductor is always the same. So you have to take the last 2 or 3 pages of a bank, and every bank has the same conductor frames in it, so that when you go to a new car, at least he looks the same and acts the same. So we're using it to help us make deeper games, but also it's very helpful because things have to be replicated from bank to bank because the machine can only address 4K at a time.
But occasionally it will be a problem where you say, I've got all these extra bytes, I can't say I'm done yet.
Right.
So
Add more.
that's part of Casey's problem.
Yeah,
That was part of Casey's problem. Add more,
I can't imagine.
and then add some more.
I'm sure there will be a cartridge that we put out in the future that doesn't use all 32 banks. Now, we can't buy a smaller ROM,
Right.
so it's going to be a 32 banks, one or another. What's going to happen is we're going to have some game, like I'm working on something right now, that I could see really only being 4 or 6 banks, and that's it. And I know in the 11th hour, I'll say, I'm just going to ship it that way, and then I'm going to say, no, wait, there's this cool, gigantic thing I can do if I just duplicate it in every bank and reanimate it. I can come up with something stupid. But, the game doesn't have to take 32 banks.
But that's interesting.
But the question does bring up a philosophical issue, and that is, when you have limits, it does direct you to a certain direction. Garry mentioned the book Racing the Beam. I don't know if you have any interest in the technology that went behind this kind of stuff, get that book. And the premise of that book is that the console can affect the type of games that are done on the console. That's really where they went when they were starting this book. And the Atari 2600 is the most dramatic example of that. Obviously, it's only got 2 objects. You have to figure out how to use those 2 objects multiple times and such. So yeah, I've always enjoyed having constraints and figuring out how to make the most out of those constraints. And in middle parts of my career where it was as many bytes as I wanted to have, it wasn't as easy to figure out what do I want to do if there's no limitations whatsoever.
Yep.
Which brings up an interesting philosophical question I have proposed to these two guys. Can we create a game today that we would have sold in 1982 that's in essence a 4K game and people will still accept it? Or do you expect us to do hundreds of screen multi-layer adventures because we have a bigger ROM? Can I make a 4 or 8K game just like I did in 1982 and it'll be accepted?
Oh, I think absolutely.
I think
If it's
you're
fun
probably
and
right.
addictive.
You're probably
No
right,
one's-
yes.
No one's gonna look into the code and say, yeah, but.
The exception to that was Circus Convoy was going to be our first return. And so every time we've met face to face, we said it's got to be bigger, it's got to be better. You know?
Yeah, there was enormous pressure. We kept working on it and working on it and working on it, and then there were 5 mini games in. And I said, Dave, we gotta do another one. We had to keep pushing the bar so high that there was no possibility that we would put it out and somebody would say, compared to the stuff you used to do, this sucks. You know, it had to really set the bar, so that's
Which-
why we worked 3 years on it.
Which is part of the issue with Casey's Gold. I gave these guys a game 2 years ago that I said, I think I'm done. And honestly, they pushed the bar so high that we all looked at it and said, it isn't good enough. And so, because of Circus Convoy, I had to go back many times and make the game as good as I could because they had done such an incredible job. I wanted to make sure it just approached what they had done.
That was more an issue of, rather than taking one particular gameplay mechanic and just getting longer and longer and longer,
Right.
we wanted to see where there's different things to do.
Diversity. I had one particular, I had just train levels and frankly, the testers looked at it and said, you gotta get off the train at some point. It's
You
just
can't-
too many trains, and so, yes, Dave's right, it was a matter of not extending the same gameplay, but changing it up, which is what I had to do, and it was trial and error.
So what was that wave? Is that 5 minutes?
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
5 minutes.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so I wanted to address what you were saying about working within limitations. I know in my experience in the industry, people would often balk at the limitations, and I think like you, like pushing against boundaries, and I think that, I think it was important what you were saying about that philosophy, so that what's a great example of where one of those limitations forced you to come up with a really creative answer?
Good question.
I don't know, I think it really just sent us in a different direction. So it's like, you would never even think about going that direction. Like, I would have never done Pac-Man, because it needed too many objects and the flicker would drive me crazy.
Right.
So there are things you just simply didn't do, so you had to figure out something really cool to do going in this other direction.
Yeah, but there's a very obvious example
I'm glad you think
What's
so.
that?
of your work.
I'm glad you think so.
You could have used 2K for data tables in defining the Pitfall world, but you did,
Oh, that's right.
you did it in 25 bytes
With
because you had to, because of the limitation.
That's
That-
true.
That was the big one.
Yeah, that's true. All those 255 screens, as Dave will tell you, is created using something like 8 different bits in a polynomial equation, as opposed to big data tables of where the trees are.
Right, everyone else would do it with the data table. You know, this bit defines this bit, this bit, this bit, this bit, but that's a big table. But to just write an algorithm that creates a repeatable sequence and then look at what comes out of the algorithm and say the third bit is this, the fifth bit is this, that was brilliant. It was a dynamically created world on the fly with 20 lines of code.
And the only really hard part about it, and I don't even know how I did it or if I could replicate it, but we all had these polynomial counters we used. They were generally kind of a random number generator, but it was a seeded sequence. I figured out an algorithm that would run forward and backward.
I don't know how you did it.
amazing, yeah.
Yeah, I remember I did it. It's in there. I just don't remember how I did it.
So the same screen comes up if you go that way.
Yeah, if you run off the right side of the screen, it goes to the next number in the sequence in one direction, and if you run off the left side of that same screen, it backs up through the same sequence into the previous number. And, you know.
All right, last question. That was a great question, by the way. Last question. In the middle here. Nope, you, right there. No, he's already said one. You haven't. Right?
Oh, yeah, I wanted to know if you had any homebrew games from other developers that you liked.
Yeah, there are a few.
Yeah, John Champeau does great work.
Yeah, and the thing Dave was saying about us not using a crutch or us not using, that is not a slam on John Champeau. His work is fabulous. He does tremendous work, and we would never say a bad thing about it. I've bought many of his games. You know, he just chooses to go in one direction, we choose to go in another direction.
Arrogantly.
But yes, arrogantly choosing it. But there are a lot of great homebrew games. I can't name any of them, but sometimes I see them and go, we should call that guy. Maybe we
Amoeba
get
Jump is
another-
fun, there's been many of them that are wonderful. Patrick, you had a question, last question?
Yeah, I had this is, we love living vicariously through you guys. Have you thought of a game that might incorporate both joystick and paddle simultaneously?
Oh my God.
I think if I'm not mistaken, Dave, I never did one, but don't you have to read the paddle every scan line, so it kind of takes away from what you can do on the
You're
screen?
actually reading it in the kernel. It takes away from what you can do on this display, but I would love to be able to use the driving controller, but it was never sold separately. It only
right.
came with the
Oh,
D500.
God, that's
and so
horrible.
as soon as they did that, we could never make another game that used it.
I was actually thinking about an idea that's a two-player head-to-head. Each person has their, that'd be kind of cool.
Yeah.
You know, because I always loved ice hockey.
Yeah, two-player games are fun.
Two-player game. I actually have a concept that could work as a two-player game.
Thank you.
But that's secret.
That's secret.
We do have games in development, but we can't tell you because you'll never leave the room alive.
All right. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and here are a few more videos for you to check out.